Hello. Today I'm going to be explaining HDMI 2.1. There are two parts of HDMI, the port itself and the cable. To better separate which is which, I'll be using the term HDMI X for the port and X cable for the cable itself. For example, HDMI 2.1 would be the port and ultra high-speed cable would be the HDMI 2.1 compliant cable. This is a long video that is very, very information heavy, but I promise it's worth it, and by the end, you'll be an HDMI expert. I'll be going over 5 things. First, the different HDMI standards. Second, what is needed for everything to work. Third, explaining the features of HDMI 2.1. Fourth, important information about HDMI cables. Fifth, and last, some issues you may see with a defective cable. Timestamps are down below in case you feel like skipping ahead or all around. So, let's get nerdy. Starting off with number 1, going into a brief history to clear up some naming, we've gone from HDMI 1.4, the port, that supports up to 10.2 gigabytes per second and were paired with high-speed cables, to HDMI 2.0 port, which supports 18 gigabits per second and came with premium high-speed cables, to the latest HDMI 2.1 port, which is rated for 48 gigabits per second and should be paired with ultra high-speed cables. To check what port your device has, you can check 2 places. For monitors/TVs, it should be next to the port itself. If it isn't there, or you have a laptop, dedicated graphics card, HDMI switch, etc., you'll likely have to look at the manufacturer's website by looking up the name of your device and looking under the spec section. Whereas for the cable itself, it may just say on the actual sleeving of the HDMI cable. If it is certified, it should have a label to notify you, but some cables don't actually do that, so you'll just have to remember or test to see if it fully works or not. Sometimes it's also on the head of the cable right here as well, if it's not on the sleeve. HDMI 2.1 has all of the features of HDMI 2.0, which has all the features of HDMI 1.4, so it is backwards compatible. So are the cables, but the cables are a bit more complicated and nuanced, which I'll get into later. But high-level overview, an ultra-high-speed cable, which is compliant with HDMI 2.1, will be able to be used on all HDMI ports effectively. Whereas if you have a cable that doesn't fully meet spec, such as a high-speed cable, which would meet the HDMI 1.4 standard, it will only work on an HDMI 1.4 device. But that's not really 100% true, so like I said, make sure that you stick around or skip to the cable section of this overview. So, moving on to the second part of this video, the basics. To cover the basics and to get the full benefits of HDMI 2.1, you'll need everything in the chain to have correct ratings/specs. This chain includes the source device, which is the computer, console, Blu-ray player, etc., to have a 2.1 port, the display, or the monitor, TV, etc., to also have an HDMI 2.1 port and an HDMI cable that provides full 48 gigabit speeds. Usually for HDMI 2.1 would be known as ultra high speed cables. Say if you have an HDMI 2.0 port paired with an HDMI 2.1 port and are using an ultra high speed cable, then you'll be limited to HDMI 2.0 speeds, as it will always default to the port with the lowest speeds. Or alternatively, if you have 2 HDMI 2.1 ports on the source and the display device, but then you have an HDMI cable that for whatever reason can't give you full 48 gigabit speeds, which again, I'll discuss more later on, then you'll likely just get a black screen as the cable itself doesn't have enough bandwidth to properly push the signal to the other end. However, if you were to use that same cable and say plug it into an HDMI 2.0 device, and it worked, then it would mean that cable supports up to 18 gigabits or premium high-speed cable speeds instead of ultra high-speed cable speeds. Or it could just be a bad cable. So now that the basics are out of the way, you can jump into the actual specs of HDMI 2.1. So, starting off with first, they have a bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second. The previous standard, as discussed, was 18 gigabits, and prior to that, it was 10.2 gigabits. This allows for a multitude of resolutions and frame rates, or aka hertz. I won't go into all of them, but we'll throw some of the most common ones on the screen right now. Second, color depth is up to 12 bits per color component. Most displays are 8-bit these days, with the higher-end TV/displays on the standardized market being around 10 bits. I'm sure there's a 12-bit panel somewhere that exists, but that would be in more of the niche market. Third, it supports dynamic HDR. We've gone from standard dynamic range, also known as SDR, to static HDR, to dynamic high dynamic range, or dynamic HDR. Normal TV, most of YouTube, and videos on the internet in general are SDR, with your HDR being on your 4K Blu-rays and some streaming platforms such as Disney Plus and Netflix. And sometimes those premium HDR tiers do require a higher paid tier, such as Netflix. You have to get like the $19.99 one instead of, I don't know what their standard one is because that's not the one that I pay for. Previously, HDR was static, which meant it wouldn't change while you were watching it. Examples of this standard are HLG or HDR10. The new dynamic HDR standard includes Dolby Vision and HDR10+. HDR10+ and HDR10 are very similar, which adjusts the HDR metadata by a scene-by-scene or frame-by-frame basis for the best image quality. For more information on this, I recommend you checking out my 4K TV Technology Explained, breaking down all that jargon. Link is in the description below if you're interested, as I might be changing that title because it's not super great. Fourth, it has something called Source-Based Tone Mapping, or SBTM, which allows for more accurate HDR, but does not replace the previous HDR standards we just discussed, such as HDR10, HLG, HDR10+, or Dolby Vision. But instead, it adds to that as it uses your TV or monitor's HDR metadata to automatically optimize the HDR settings for the best possible image quality. Without this, it relies on what the media is transmitting. So for example, the media you're watching might max out at 2000 nits brightness, but if your screen is only capable of 500 nits, then it might oversaturate the brightness of that image, whereas the SBTM, it will see that device can only do 500 nits, so it will set that as the max, not oversaturating the image and giving you a better picture quality. Another example that they used is if you have one HDR video thing playing at a time, and then you have standard definition video playing at the same time on the same screen, it's able to effectively give you that full HDR image for just that without having to make the whole screen HDR, which is kind of interesting. Moving on to point number 5 is something called Enhanced Audio Return Channel, or better known as eARC. This simplifies connectivity by allowing you to plug in multiple devices to a TV, such as a console, streaming stick, and Blu-ray player, and allow all of those devices to play audio through the same exact soundbar or AV system without you having to fiddle and change the HDMI cables around. It supports high bitrate lossless audio formats up to 192 kHz, 24-bit uncompressed 5.1 and 7.1, along with 32-channel uncompressed audio, which is a mouthful. It also supports DTS HD Master Audio, DTS-X, Dolby True HD, Dolby Atmos. Both the TV and the AV receiver or soundbar need to have an eARC port for this to work correctly. Previously, there was something called Audio Return Channel, or ARC, which is very similar, and one would assume incorrectly that eARC is backwards compatible with ARC because that's how things usually work, but one would be wrong, as for some reason it's not defined to be backwards compatible, which isn't to say it is or isn't, but that mileage may vary depending on the device, so you'll need to look it up depending on what it is. Sixth, we're going into more of the gaming-centric features, starting off with Auto Low Latency Mode, or ALLM. Previously, you had to go into your TV settings and select Game Mode, and with that, it would automatically switch off some settings on your TV to read lower latency. However, now, that is automatically done once it reads that low latency mode is advised, such as with console gaming or PC use. This reduces the input latency for a smoother and more satisfying gaming experience, as TVs have a lot of processing that happens behind the scenes and to increase picture quality, but this also adds latency as it's having to process things, which doesn't matter for normal media viewing because it could be super laggy, but you would never notice because you'd always be up to date because you're not actually interacting with it. But for games, it will turn off some of these features while still looking really good, but you get a lot better responsiveness, and that's what you want when gaming, is to have the least amount of latency from your device and your movement. You'll notice this mostly with Twitch-based games such as first-person shooters. Moving on to number 7, variable refresh rate, or VRR. This again is mostly for gaming, but is also important for QMS, which we'll discuss next. It dynamically adjusts the refresh rate to match the frame rate of the content. This is beneficial, as without this, you can get screen tearing and stuttering, which makes things less visually appealing and less smooth. VRR is technically VESA's or VESA's, I don't know how to say that, to be completely honest with you, version of adaptive sync, while some other adaptive syncs that you've probably heard of are NVIDIA's G-Sync and AMD's FreeSync, which essentially do the same thing. Moving on to number 8, Quick Media Switching, or QMS. This hasn't quite hit most devices yet, unless if you're right there on the cutting edge, but it is coming. When there is a display change of any type, whether that be hertz, resolution, or SDR to HDR, HDR to SDR, the screen will flash black to sync to the new settings. QMS aims to eliminate part of this as long as the resolution stays the same and only the frame rate changes by utilizing the VRR, where it will, because normally what happens is you have a frame come up and then it goes to a black frame to do the new settings, and then there's a new frame and then a black frame and then a new frame. With this, it'll skip those black frames and go straight to the image frame. However, both devices need to support it. As mentioned, most older devices don't have this feature, but a firmware update may be able to unlock it on your legacy device. I use legacy here just because it's older, and where going forward, this should be on pretty much all TVs and stuff like that. For example, it is currently on the newest generation of Apple's 4K TV. An example of this in the real world would be on my 4K Apple TV. I can have it set to SDR 60 Hz, as that is more responsive when I'm navigating through the menus and everything like that. But when I switch over to a TV show, I like to have it on the native resolution and everything like that, so it'll switch to 24 Hertz. So my screen will flash black to sync that change. With this setting, this would eliminate that black screen, and all I would do is just press play and the media would start playing without the black screen, which is just really neat, and I'm really excited to actually see this in person. 9th is quick frame transport. This reduces latency for smoother, no-lag gaming and real-time interactive virtual reality. It does this by trying to push the picture faster so that it is ready sooner to try and decrease the display latency, as cables can't do a whole lot or ports to change that so much. So this is just one thing that they're trying out. Honestly, I don't understand this one a whole lot, but I just wanted to throw it in there as it is part of the standard. 10th, we've got fixed rate link, or FRL. This is a signaling technology necessary to achieve high uncompressed resolutions, such as those above 4K 60, as well as the ultra high speed bandwidths up to 48 gigabits per second. It also required for compressed video transport, which in turn enables operation at lower data rates, for example 4K 60 and ultra high pixel video rate such as 10K 120. This replaces TDMS, but it still supports it. So now that we understand the features of HDMI 2.1, I'm going to clear up some of the confusion regarding the cable themselves. You may have heard that with HDMI being digital, it either works or it doesn't. And that spending more money on an HDMI is not worth it, as it will not show increased picture/audio quality. And this is pretty much completely correct, as the quality of components is important, but at a certain point, it just becomes marketing where the benefits you gain are minimal or at worst, snake oil. If you're not familiar with the term snake oil, that pretty much just means it claims to do something, but in reality, it doesn't actually do that thing. As we dip into 48 gigabits per second, quality components are important at pushing that much data, as pushing that much data can be difficult and requires tighter tolerances and materials to reach those full speeds, where previously at lower speeds, they had a lot more headroom, so the tolerances didn't have to be as tight as they are now. Currently, there are two main cables. I'm going to call them the copper HDMI cable and the fiber optic HDMI cable. Most cables these days have copper internals, among other things. If you're interested in what else is inside of an HDMI cable, I'll have a Linus Tech Tips video linked in the description. Then the fiber optic HDMI cables are kind of hybrid cables where they have fiber optic and copper inside, which is mostly ideal for long distances. This material is superior to previous steel/aluminum as it has better conductivity. Some cables use the term silver-plated copper. This is mostly snake oil, and I use mostly here as it does give better electrical/thermal conductivity over pure copper, as silver provides the best electrical/thermal conductivity of any metal while being soft to compress and form around any defects in the copper wire to fill small voids. This doesn't necessarily add anything other than increasing the percentage of the cable making full spec, but remember that it either works or it doesn't work. So if the cable hits spec with just pure copper and then you add extra costs by adding silver plating, but say if pure copper wasn't enough and for whatever absurd reason you decided to then take that copper and add silver plating to it, then it may fill in those voids that prevented it earlier from working originally to be able to reach full spec. So that would be the reason why it would be a beneficial thing to have that on there. With copper HDMI cables, a thicker gauge wire is going to be better, especially if you're going for distance. The higher the number, the lower the gauge, as they like to make things super difficult. They have shown that 1.5 meter cables shouldn't pass 32 gauge, and 8.0 meters shouldn't pass 24 gauge, as on the short end, that becomes so thin that breaking becomes a concern, and on the longer end, the cable becomes so thick and cumbersome that it's hard to manipulate. Thankfully, this is where fiber optic cables excel, as they are able to go in long distances while keeping the gauge of the wire smaller and easier to manipulate. The outer housing, which is going to be this guy right here, of a cable doesn't improve performance, but it does help it last longer. One example of this is the gold plating. This gives a higher end appearance, improves the longevity for plugging/unplugging as it wears down slower, and also protects against corrosion, as oxidization/corrosion can occur when two different metals are paired. Since oxidization doesn't conduct electricity well, we want to avoid it as much as possible, as the more oxidization and corrosion that occurs, the more electrical resistance and higher likelihood that cable won't effectively reach from point A to point B. Gold is used as it has a low electrical resistance, which is a win, is extremely resistant to oxidization, another win, and looks fancy, which is a triple win. So when paired, you get wins across the board. But you get these wins at a higher cost, which is the negative. Nickel is very similar, but doesn't look as cool, so usually isn't used. Technically, the internals of an ultra high-speed cable, premium high-speed cable, and high-speed cable are going to be essentially the same. And if the manufacturer didn't cut any corners and use quality materials to begin with, they should work on anything. For example, I have a monster HDMI cable from 2013 that works on HDMI 2.1 just fine, even though the HDMI 2.1 standard didn't release until 2017 and didn't hit consumer markets until after that, as all the bandwidth requirements are mostly focused on the HDMI port itself over the cable. Purchasing a cable that is labeled ultra high speed cable just gives you a better assurance that the cable is put through better manufacturing processes to minimize the defects in the metal used, which is also going to likely be copper over a different metal that would hurt the signal and cause increased latency, along with using quality externals to help reduce interference. Which brings us to the final point, which is a failing cable. So what are some symptoms of a failing cable? With HDMI, assuming the signal arrives in a reasonable amount of time, at a high enough amplitude, and then it will be able to read at no loss of ones or zeros, because it's digital. However, if there is something wrong with the cable that causes increased latency and or reduced amplitude, such as defects in the metal, using the wrong metal, and or interference from wireless devices, those ones and zeros may not be able to effectively be read. This can lead to colored pixels, fuzz, blurry image, discolored or intermittent picture, loss of audio channels, and or popping of audio, or most likely, absolutely no picture at all. If you're using a fiber optic cable, it may show some of these symptoms, but it won't actually be defective, as sometimes with those, if the cable is bent so severely, it can cut off the light that it's using or reflect that light backwards, causing said abnormalities. So if you're having issues with a fiber optic cable, make sure to correct any bends before you throw it out. Also, if you're not getting a picture and you try it on an older device, it still might work. For example, those monster cables, one of the oldest ones that I have, don't reach the specs fully. So it's one of those that if I plug it into my 2.1 and 2.1 port, it won't show a picture. However, if I plug it into a 2.0 port, it will show a picture because it's able to read those speeds, but not the higher end ones, because something in there is causing it to not be able to effectively transmit that signal. Linus Tech Tips also did some testing and found that for copper cables longer than 15 feet, found that 50% of them failed, which again is why it is advised to use fiber optic cables for longer distances, as they use light, which is less prone to interference and all that jazz. So it just is able to push things a little bit further, and then it uses the copper inside of it for all of the audio functions and other handshaking that needs to occur. Okay, we finally reached the end of this very long video. Like it if you liked it. If you hated it and I droned on way too much, give me a dislike. If you want to see more like this, do hit that subscribe button. Otherwise, I will see you and your beautiful face on the next one. God bless and peace out.